Like many other art forms, basically all of them, photography has always operated under a certain type of privilege. For almost 2 centuries, people have treated photography as a sense of truth. Now, from the moment that the medium was created, the camera, in and of itself, has been described as objective. It's mechanical, scientific, incapable of having bias because it's just a recorder of light. The story goes a little something like this, where the camera doesn't discriminate. It simply records what's there. And that is true to a certain extent. The camera in and of itself cannot discriminate. The problem lies in the idea and the historic idea that if something is photographed, then that in and of itself is truth. And that idea, as you could imagine, has been very problematic throughout the entire history of photography. And today we're going to be talking exactly about that problem. All right, we got through the intro. Thanks for making it through that. Hi, my name is Jared Thomas Tapia. I'm a social documentary photographer and educator here in New York City, and you're watching the YouTube channel. Welcome. Across my social media platforms, I have 5 different segments: crafting a photograph, life through the lens, marks of the maker, the creative connection, and tools of the trade. Throughout all of these segments, each of them have a very specific thing that we talk about within the elements of photography. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about a topic within life through the lens, and that is the racist past of photography. And just the racism of photography, really, because it's still prevalent in today's world. Now, photography, every system set up by humans, unfortunately, reflects the values within society. So it should be absolutely no surprise that photography didn't accidentally get entangled in racism. Like I said, a camera is incapable in and of itself of being racist. So think about it as photography kind of got recruited into racism. So we have to take it all the way back to 1839, which is when the daguerreotype first came into play. The daguerreotype is basically the first representation of a full camera. Now, it's important to note the historical context of the 18th century, especially during the 1830s and 1820s, was a time where human beings were obsessed and were kind of having an enlightenment in things like science and analytics and measurement and classification. And it's even more important to note what the 19th century brought about, which was basically mass colonization of the world through Europe. If you mix those two things together, it's not a good combination. 19th century was the globalization of the empire, and it was mass colonization, and at this point, scientists were cataloging plants and animals and human beings. Anthropologists specifically really believed that they were capable of classifying people into racial hierarchies using objective measurements. And it was almost as if, in the most messed up way possible, the camera arrived at the perfect moment to make that happen. Here's a device that doesn't take any brush strokes, doesn't need any sort of artistic approach, and is able to literally show you exactly what you're looking at. Obviously, this would make photography very appealing to those with a certain agenda that wanted a visual proof of their incredibly racist racial theories, which is why we have to talk about one of the most disturbing ones, which was in 1850. Harvard scientist Louis Agassiz, I believe is how you say the name, basically commissioned a bunch of daguerreotypes of enslaved Africans in South Carolina. 2 of the most well-known photographs were of 2 people named Renti and Delia. They were stripped down to the waist, and they were photographed from basically every angle possible. Now let's make something very clear, that these photographs were not portraits. They were not documentary. They were seen as scientific evidence. There was virtually zero human sort of thought behind photographing Renti and Delia. These scientists intended to use these photographs as some sort of evidence to support their theory of something called polygenism, which is basically the idea that different races were created separately and were biologically unequal. The camera gave these ideas authority, and I've thought, you might think, I don't know, but I've thought about that if not for the daguerreotype and the process behind photographing, would their studies be chalked up as prejudice? Because words are just words on a page sometimes, but the ability to see these things being human beings, paired with their theory, gave it validity in the eyes of society and other scientists. So I have to think, if they didn't have these photographs, would it have been taken as seriously? And I just don't know. Now, it did work, unfortunately, and it was a successful theory. So successful that it spread across the world, and scientists everywhere started photographing either indigenous people or enslaved people or minorities in and around every colonized place of the world, doing basically the same thing: categorizing people, cataloging them as specimens. These photographs would be displayed at world fairs, and they would be put in scientific journals, and they were hung up in museums. And it's important to note that photography in and of itself didn't create this racist racial hierarchy, but it did help it visualize and legitimize it. Now, I do want to try and not talk just about all of the most awful things, although it's very hard not to, but I do want to provide some sort of context as to how these images have since then been repurposed, because they have, by an incredible artist and photographer named Carrie Mae Weems. You've probably seen this body of work before because it's incredibly moving and just very powerful, and I feel as if everybody should see this work. It's one of those types of work that I truly believe that everybody should see. It's called "From Here I Saw What Happened and Cried," and it's basically a full installation of a lot of these daguerreotypes. Weems basically talks about exactly what I just talked about through the photography playing a very crucial role in basically how history kind of represented supporting that racist hierarchy. So I think that everybody should take the time to, if you can, try and see that work. I saw it at the MoMA a couple of years ago, and it was very powerful. But we must push forward. Now we're moving on to another part of what I just don't feel like white people specifically understand about racism. White people have a problem when they discuss racism of thinking, especially really racist white people, they only think about racism as slavery, and they only talk about it as if racism only existed in the physical, and that's just simply not true. A big problem, very specifically in today's world, but has really been a huge issue within all of history, has been an absence of Black voices or people of color voices. And as the 20th century started to form, that absence became a very big pattern. And this ties into systemic racism. When you think about the rise in major publications, so things like newspapers and magazines and journals and galleries and museums, all of these institutions were overwhelmingly controlled by white curators and white editors. They shaped not only, what was shown and who was photographed, but more specifically, who was allowed to photograph. And what was being shown was people of color in front of the lens, usually in a very bad light, specifically in moments of crisis, in poverty, in famine, in war, in civil unrest. But they were far less visible behind the lens. Now, this meant that their communities were predominantly photographed from outside of their community and outside of their control. The scholar Bell Hook once wrote that the camera is a weapon of violence against black bodies when wielded without accountability. Now, sometimes that violence doesn't mean brutality. Sometimes it's narrowing, and most of the time that meant reducing communities to stereotypes just to drive a certain narrative. Think about it. If a community is mostly photographed during moments of suffering, then that suffering becomes that community's identity to the rest of society. Meanwhile, everyday life within these communities is completely decimated from any type of archive of history. This is a perfect example when we think about the civil rights movement, right? Especially white people, when we think about the civil rights movement. We see images of the civil rights movement, and so much of that imagery is in black and white. And black and white makes us feel as if these events are older than they actually are. Now, of course, this is partly because of technology and because of film and everything like that, but it's also a deliberate choice because during this time period, color photography is on the rise. And it's just so crazy to me that black and white makes things feel as if they've been closed off. They're complete. Yet, the civil rights movement happened within living memory. Most of our parents, if you're my age, were born either just before the civil rights movement happened or during the civil rights movement, which means that your grandparents were actively going through the civil rights movement. And I think it goes without saying that many of the issues that were risen during the civil rights movement are still very prevalent in today's society that so many people still struggle under, which is why photography doesn't just show history, it shapes how history feels and it shapes how history is told. And to continue on about representation and the lack thereof, now let's talk about something that's a little bit more technical with photography, but still very telling of just how racist photography has been. This is something else that a lot of people that look like me really struggle with understanding when it comes to racism, and it's the fact that if you get past part one of understanding that racism isn't only a physical act, but also a systemic act, there is also a bias within institutions and the way that things are made for access to white people, but not people of color. Photography is no different. The racist ideologies of people was embedded within the technical aspects of photography itself. And this came around when the development of color film was being created. For decades and decades, color film, and really just film in general, was calibrated for white skin. Photo labs had these things called Shirley cards, SHIRLEY. Basically, they were reference photos of white women used to standardize color coordination. If Shirley looked correct, then the print was deemed on point. But when photographing darker skin tones, most of the time they were processed poorly. Shadows collapsed and details kind of hollowed out. Photographers would have to compensate manually through either exposure or through your f-stops. And even then, if you did do those things manually, the lab that you send your photographs off to might try and correct the image according to a Shirley card reference. Why did this happen? Market assumptions. Film manufacturers designed film around the consumers they believed were going to be purchasing their products more. And that consumer was just assuming to be white. Now, interestingly enough, major improvements to color film have since occurred, but not because of racial misrepresentation. No, you thought that these companies were doing something good? Not at all. They were actually changing because of furniture, which is crazy. Furniture and chocolate companies both paved the way to getting better color tones for people of color, because brown furniture was showing up to orange and dark chocolate was showing up purple. Commerce and capitalism inherently solved a racial issue that ethics of these companies ignored for decades, which should remind us that technology reflects the priorities of the people who build it. Now let's get into yet another racist part of the history of photography, and that has to do with stereotypes within the media. And this is still incredibly prevalent in today's media, especially now. Let's think about Rodney King. Let's think about even before Rodney King. Let's think about, actually, let's think about Jamal Shabazz's work, right? And his ability to go within his communities here in New York City and photograph what it was really like for people of color living in New York City in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and how that was drastically different from the way that people of color were documented in news outlets. Photojournalism in and of itself often relied on visual shorthand. Certain communities, especially the Black community, became visually tied to things like poverty and crime and civil unrest. Crime coverage specifically really dove into portraying Black people as suspects disproportionately to any other race. International reporting often depicted African or Latin Americans primarily as the crime doers, photographing them through the lens of conflict and disaster. And the repetition of these images just constantly hitting the mainframe of most of society, even worldwide, but specifically here in the West, creates this echo chamber of racist ideologies and stereotypes that are then placed among everybody else within society. Of course, that's perpetuated by white people. Psychologists call this an availability bias. What we see often feels like a representation of reality. And photography has a very acute way of influencing very quietly. You know, one image rarely changes perception. It can, but it rarely does. But thousands upon thousands of photographs of similar images absolutely can. Now, it's very important to remember that just because all of these things were happening does not mean that there were not voices actively protesting and speaking out and using their voice and using their artistic freedom to counteract a lot of these stereotypes and racism. Many, many, many photographers did challenge the system. To name a few, obviously the one that everybody knows is Gordon Parks, period. He used the camera to confront inequality directly. He was the first staff photographer of color at Life magazine. And what made him so special is that he was able to photograph poverty and unrest and segregation while humanizing his subjects. Parks has famously said that the camera was his choice of weapon, and the camera is a weapon against poverty and racism. And then there's Roy DeCarava, who photographed Black life in Harlem with such dignity and integrity and intimacy. And I think what makes him so incredible is his refusal to sensationalize struggle. And then, of course, as I said at the beginning of this video, it was Carrie Mae Weems, who has gone on to do so many other amazing bodies of work that represent the fight against racism and anti-establishment, and using her own body to place herself within photographic narratives that are just as powerful as the project that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. And then, of course, I just briefly talked about Jamel Shabazz, but Jamel Shabazz, documenting Black life and youth in New York City with a sense of pride and an unbelievable amount of collaboration between subject and photographer. And LaToya Ruby Frazier. She used photography to examine the industrial decline and family history from within the community that she was in. These photographers didn't just diversify photography, they completely changed it. I think it's incredibly important that everybody knows these photographers, and this is just a handful. Do some more research on some of the more unknown people of color artists, because there are so many. So what does this mean for today? It's important to know that understanding the history isn't about shame. Specifically, it's not about shame. You're probably going to feel shameful. I do. But it's not to make you feel shamed. And this doesn't just have to do with the history of photography. This has to do with the history of the world. I think that, again, a lot of people that look like me feel as if when people of color want us to learn about history, it's to shame us. And that's not the case whatsoever. It's to have an understanding. It's about responsibility, especially in a medium that is often deemed as truthful. Understanding where that truthfulness can be misconstructed creates power. There's power in knowing that you can purposefully misconstruct narratives. And so it's a responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. I mean, I just took you through the entire history of reinforcing those stereotypes and how that's perpetuated so much racism and so much struggle. But it's just as easy to dismantle these ideas. I've said this before, and I'll continue saying it for however long that I live, but each photograph that you take is a decision. Where you stand, what you photograph, when you photograph, what you include, what you leave out. All of these decisions accumulate. They form a visual hierarchy and a visual memory that future generations are going to look at. Today, we live in an era of constant image production. Billions of photographs circulate online every single day, which means the archive of our time is being built in real time right now. That gives photographers a choice. We can either repeat the visual shortcuts of the past, or we can completely dismantle them, or at the very least, complicate them. Photography has an innate ability to repair just as much as it has to destroy, but only if we as the photographers are prepared and are willing and will take the responsibility of practicing awareness. Let me make this very clear. You are not responsible for the past. You are not responsible for photography's past, but you are incredibly responsible for the images of the future. The camera has always been a mirror. Sometimes it's reflected prejudice, sometimes courage, but today it reflects us, our ethics, our literacy, our willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past, and our willingness to shape the future. The camera is in your hands, so don't treat it as such a small idea. All right, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope that this was educational. I hope that you maybe learned some things. I hope that I got my points across efficiently and that nothing came off as insensitive. I think that it's an honor to be able to talk about these things and to bring this sort of education to a new generation of artists. I highly encourage you to do some research for yourself. There is a coordinating Substack article that's going to be released with this YouTube video as well, so you can dive into all of those things. But do some research for yourself and check out all of those artists that I mentioned. I hope that this was good. You can find me on Instagram at Jared Tapey. You can find me on TikTok at Jared Thomas Tapey _. You can find me on Substack at The Creative Connection is my publication. And then here on YouTube. So I hope that you enjoyed, and that's it. So get out there and get shooting.